honored to be hosting a conversation with Reverend Dr. Sherry Molock, who serves as the Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at George Washington University and is the founding pastor of the beloved Community Church, United Church of Christ. I also want to give a shout out to Heather Daniel, who is running Zoom behind the scenes today. If you have questions about technicalities or whatever, go ahead and ask Heather about anything you want to know. Also, a special shout out to Jenna O, who runs suicide prevention for one of our local counties and is someone who attends here at Portland Covenant. She's the one who really got us in touch with Dr. Sherry, so we're grateful for her today. Just to give a very quick overview of what you can expect, I'm just going to hand things over to Dr. Sherry for about 40 minutes so she can do what she does. Then we're going to be opening it up for about 20 minutes of questions. And at that point, you're going to ask your questions to Heather, and she's going to be asking those for us. And then we're going to end by providing folks with more information on how they can continue and learn and grow. So with all that said, I'm truly excited to hear from our speaker today, and I'm simply going to get out of the way. Would you all please welcome Reverend Dr. Sherry Molock.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I was telling your pastor that this was the highlight or the icing on my cake today. I'm always excited when I can talk to faith communities about suicide prevention. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to give a little introduction by way of something I do. I've been doing for about 10 years now, as I always talk about my context, because we all have a context. And so even if we don't think we have one, and our context shapes who we are, it shapes our perspective on things. I think particularly, sometimes we think as scientists that we don't have a perspective, or that our perspective is always very objective, and even in science. And certainly we know in faith communities, your background shapes a lot of how you see people. So I want to, again, thank your pastor for inviting me. Thank Heather in the background for doing all the tech stuff, and thank Jenna for actually introducing me to your pastor. So let me share a little bit about myself first. So this is a collage that I do when I teach, when I present at scientific conferences. Again, to talk about, all of us have multiple contexts, and those things shape us. So if you look in my upper left-hand corner, that's my dad. My dad is 94. And he's still going strong. And so I always put pictures of him because it's such a blessing that he's still here, has all his faculties. He still walks about 2 miles a day. And I also think he looks really great for 94. So I always put his pictures up there. This is my husband and myself. He is the love of my life. He and I have been married for 34 years. We co-pastor a church called the Beloved Community Church. It is a United Church of Christ church. We didn't start off as United Church of Christ. We started off as non-denominational. We've been, the church is 12 years old. We've been UCC for about 5 years now. This is me either preaching or singing. I love to sing. I'm not a great singer, but I do love to sing. And so I'm in, even though I shouldn't be doing it, I am in our praise team. And so that's a really a blessing for me. This is a picture of my oldest daughter, Amber, who I call my first love. She is going to be 30. This is her ex-boyfriend. They're not together anymore, but I like this picture, so I show it anyway. This is my husband, my youngest daughter, Diara, who's going to be 26 next week, actually. And my son, Jelani, who's going to be 28 the week after that. This is my oldest granddaughter, Michaela, my youngest granddaughter, Olea. And I've always put my family first, because I really feel like, in spite of all the different hats that I wear, my family is what anchors me. My faith is what anchors me. And I also do it to model for graduate students that you can have a career and have a family at the same time. And sometimes as researchers, we act like we don't have a life outside of that. So sometimes when my kids were little, I would even bring them to school sometimes, just so that students would see we have children and we have childcare problems just like everybody else does. Toni Morrison is my favorite author, so that's why Beloved is up there. I'm a dog lover. I've always had dogs, and my students laugh at me. I tell them that if my partner did not like dogs, it would be a deal breaker for me. And I do mean that. So if you don't like dogs, you couldn't be married to me. This is Callie, who is a 10-year-old golden retriever mix, and Flirt, who is a 4-year-old German pinscher mix. For the last 15 years have only gotten rescue dogs because we want to provide dogs homes that don't have them. Hopefully you're not going to hear them tonight because they're up with my husband, so hopefully they will not be making an appearance. This is representing my research. So I do suicide prevention and HIV prevention work where I try to provide prevention programs in faith-based communities. And so this represents my suicide prevention work because I also am trying to develop, we're trying to actually pilot as I'm speaking, we're piloting a program for young African-American men who have sex with men and trying to figure out what's the best way to provide them with mental health resources. That's a group that is at high risk for mental health challenges, and they're also less likely to engage in mental health seeking. And so that's what this HIV awareness is about. This is me as a therapist. I don't do as much clinical work as I used to because since I've been in ministry, it's hard to do all of this. But I do occasionally still see clients from church communities. I'm right now seeing 2 clients one who's suffering from all of the anxiety that's associated with COVID-19 and has had a lot of family losses, and another client who's going through a major transition right now. The Wire is, I think, one of the best shows that's ever been produced. I love Game of Thrones. I'm a Game of Thrones fan too, but as I was making the collage recently, I thought I still can't give up The Wire as my favorite show. It's partly because it's based in Baltimore and I'm from Baltimore, but I love that show. I think I've seen it about 5 times. I do relax a lot. I make it a point to play every day, and my students are required to play. I actually make them report out before we start class, particularly now because it's a very stressful time, as we all know. And so I always challenge people, what do you do to play? So I sometimes do needlepoint. I love to read, and I read a lot. My youngest daughter loves East Asian cultures, and she's fluent in Mandarin and conversational in Korean. She's going to go to graduate school for global studies with a focus on East Asian communities. And so she has all of us hooked on Korean drama. So this is a recent drama that was called Itaewon Class, which is really good. You should watch this on Netflix. There are subtitles, and I've actually been picking up a few words here and there. I've actually taught 2 summers in a row in Seoul, Korea, teaching Chinese national students who are going to school in the United States. I've been teaching them psychology classes, and so that's been a lot of fun. My favorite cuisine is Thai food. I've never been to Thailand, but I need to go because I could eat Thai food every day. I like to try to be fit. So I was sharing with your pastor that I was taking a Zumba class right before I did this presentation to stay fit. And my favorite tea of all time is citron tea, which is a Korean tea. So I love Korean tea. It's really good for your sinuses. So if you have sinus problems, get some citron tea. Okay, why do I tell you all of this? Because while my suicide prevention research is important, I have expertise in this as a clinician. My relaxation time, my family, all of that shapes how I see this. I'm a child psychologist by training, and so I've been doing suicide prevention work for about 25 years. And one of the things that motivates me to do that is I am so aware of the anguish, particularly that parents experience when they lose a child to suicide. And I don't want anyone to ever experience that. And so I don't ever forget why I do this, and these pictures of my family remind me of how I would feel if I lost a loved one to suicide. So it's really important to me that we do that, particularly because for young people, the first 3 leading causes of death are, depending on the racial group, homicides, suicides, and accidents, and those 3 things are preventable. And I think that it's an indictment against our society that the 3 leading causes of death are preventable, and we have not made a big dent and those 3 leading causes of death. And so that's on the adults to make a world a better place for kids. Okay, I named the title of this talk, How Do We Sing in a Strange Land? This is based on Psalm 137. This is the NIV translation. And those of you who are as old as me, if you remember the play Jesus Christ Superstar, there's a beautiful song in there called On the Willows. And On the Willows is taken from this psalm. And it says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked of us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And their response was, how can we sing the songs of the Lord while we are in a foreign land? And I chose that because I think sometimes when people are caught in the throes of mental health challenges, They feel like they're in a foreign land, and it's hard to find joy. And so it's almost like everyone else around them is saying, get it together, suck it up. You can do this. Where's your willpower? If you're in a faith community, where's your faith? Why, if you really believe in God or you believe in Jesus, then of course you can't be depressed. It's antithetical. And that's not true. That's not true. First of all, if we look at the biblical text, it's not bearing witness to that. There are lots of people in the text that are depressed. Most of the major prophets are depressed. David was depressed. Some argue that Jesus was depressed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so we have lots of examples of people who were struggling with depression. And so I think that part of the how can we sing the song of the Lord's in a strange land is that we have to lend people in our communities our faith, our help, and our support so that we can help them learn and remember how to sing a song again. And I think so my approach to suicide prevention tends to be community-based. I think the faith-based communities are a wonderful avenue. It's not the only avenue, but it's a wonderful avenue for prevention efforts. So I'm going to talk about that this evening. So the outline for our webinar this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of suicide in communities of color, risk and protective factors, the impact of COVID-19 and racial injustice on the suicide rates. I've been asked this a lot, and unfortunately, I've been doing talks since, I think, end of May. And when I started doing these talks, I said, oh, we're not sure. And unfortunately, now I can't say that anymore. We know that the rates are going up. Approaches to interventions and preventions, and then I'm going to
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's chats going on where we cannot see your full screen. My name is Gwen.
Can you see it now?
Yay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
This has been happening to me all day today, and I don't know, there must be something with my computer, so thank you for telling me that. And then I'm going to give you an example from the faith community. All right, can you see the full slide now? Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about the scope of the problem. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth between the ages of 10 and 19. The suicide attempt rates rose by 73% between 1991 and 2017 for Black adolescent boys and girls, while injury by attempts rose 122% for adolescent boys during the same time period. And we also know that alarmingly, the suicide rates for Black children between ages 5 and 12 are approximately double that for white children of the same age group. That's the first time in history that has ever happened. Or this has been the first time that since they've been recording this data. Now, if you just kind of look at this slide, just to kind of give you a sense of the scope of the problem. So every 2 years, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, puts out a survey that they give to high school students. And it goes to about 38 different jurisdictions around the country. It's a nationally representative sample. And that survey is called the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The most recent data that we can find from that survey is 2017 data. So I want you to notice that one of the questions that they ask is, how many students have felt sad or hopeless during the last 12 months for at least 2 weeks in a row? So almost a third of students report feeling that way. You will notice that females have much higher rates of feeling sad and hopeless than males. There's not much difference between grades. And you will also know that Hispanic youth and Asian youth have significantly higher rates of feeling sad and hopeless compared to white youth and Black youth. This is looking at this percentage of high school students who seriously considered attempting suicide. And that seriously considering attempting, is one of the indexes we use to call attention to intent, which is you're actually thinking about suicide and you're planning it and you're thinking about making the decision, which is a really important index for us to look at about suicide risk. So you'll see that drops down. So third are thinking about feeling sad and hopeless. About 17% have considered suicide seriously. Again, almost twice as many females as males consider suicide. Not any difference between grades. And here we see a change in the data so that Asian students are significantly more likely to consider suicide compared to Black students. The rest of these groups are not significantly different from each other. Now notice that there's a difference here. So these are students who actually attempted suicide. So those who plan are about 17%, drops down to 7.4% for those who've actually made an attempt. Females are more likely to have made an attempt than males. Here we do see some differences between grades, with 11th and 12th graders being significantly less likely to make an attempt compared to 9th and 10th graders. And then here you see this completely different shift here, where Blacks are more likely to make a suicide attempt compared to white and Asian students. So one of the things, the reasons why this concerns us is because it suggests that when you look at Black youth who are thinking about suicide compared to those who actually make an attempt, that there's something about reporting these feelings that Black youth are less likely to do, which probably means that we're either not asking them the correct questions or we are missing these kids. They're underreporting their thoughts about suicide and their plans about suicide. And so that means that we probably are going to have some kids who we miss in mental health systems because we're not asking the right questions. I'll also talk a little bit about intersexuality. We also know that sexual minority youth of all communities, but particularly in communities of color, are also at high risk for suicide. We know that the rates of suicide ideation and attempts are higher for youth in the LGBT community when they're compared to their heterosexual peers. And we also know that rates for suicide attempts are higher for LGBT college students from communities of color compared to heterosexual white students and heterosexual students from communities of color. Oops, sorry about that. So let's talk about risk factors. Risk factors are characteristics that increase the likelihood that a person will develop a problematic behavior. Risk factors are not static, they can change over time. Risk factors for suicide include family history of suicide, history of depression, or other mental health problems. Incarceration, we're particularly concerned with the school to prison pipeline. We know that Black youth and Hispanic youth are more likely to receive disciplinary actions in school, and they're more likely to be referred to juvenile justice system rather than to mental health services if they are having behavioral problems in school. Easy access to lethal means. One of the best ways that you can prevent suicide is to restrict access to lethal means. The most lethal method that young people and older people use to take their lives are firearms, and so if people practice firearm safety, for example, that can significantly reduce suicide risk. Also, the second leading method that people use is usually asphyxiation or hanging. And so there's been some basic things you can do, like take away apparatuses in homes where it's easier for young people to asphyxiate themselves. ETOH is alcohol and drug use. The reason why this is a risk factor is because when you're intoxicated, your thinking is impaired. You're much more impulsive. Well, we know that young people are more likely to have impulsive behavior, and they're also more likely to make a suicide attempt impulsively. So it's also true for young people in general that they're less likely to think for long periods of time or make a really detailed plan when they are attempting suicide. Exposure to suicides of others. So there's something called modeling effects or Werther effects. This is when if you romanticize or glamorize the death of someone by suicide in the media, whether it's social media or traditional media, for young people, they're much more likely to imitate that behavior. So it's really important while we want to celebrate the life of anyone who's lost their lives, we want to make sure we don't romanticize it. And what I mean by that is, if there's an example of that in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, where about 5 years ago, there were two young women who were high school students. They were in love with each other. Their parents were very disapproving. They were ostracized and bullied at school. So they went hiking one weekend. They went up into the woods in Virginia, and they sort of had dinner, they had wine, and then they had a suicide pact and they killed themselves. The way that story was reported in the news was like they were star-crossed lovers, and there ended up being several copycat suicides after that. So it's really important. We're not saying that don't talk about it, because it's important to talk about suicide when it occurs. It's important to give young people help and get grief counselors out to see them, but it's also important not to romanticize the story itself. Residential mobility is really important. The more stable your community, even if it's an impoverished community, reduces your risk quite a bit because people know each other and feel more socially connected. I've already talked about being a member of a sexual minority. is problematic. Stigma, not just stigma with mental health, but also stigma associated with help seeking. It's amazing to me how devastating and what a barrier stigma is. So I can literally have people come talk to me about mental health challenges, be sobbing, tearful, clearly anxious or depressed. And as soon as I say, let me make a referral for you, they're like, well, I'm not crazy, no. So it's amazing that people are suffering. And so the faith community is a great place to change stigma, because the faith community is a place that shapes social norms anyway. And so we know that churches shape norms about behavior. We know that churches shape norms about educational values, achievement in school. We know that churches shape norms about volunteerism. The faith community is one of the few communities where people volunteer, know they're going to volunteer, and don't expect to be paid. So it's a natural kind of thing that we just always do. And so this is a good example where we can shape and reduce stigma of mental health challenges. One of the ways of doing that is just by talking about it. And I'll be giving you an example about that later on. If people have loss, either relational loss, social loss, work or finances, we know that exposure to racial discrimination is traumatizing. My graduate students and I, we just submitted a study that we did where we were looking at the impact of COVID-19, on college students from communities of color, and particularly students who are from Asian descent, have really been not only experiencing racial discrimination, but witnessing racial discrimination that is levied against students, Asian American students, because of people keep referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese flu or the Chinese virus, when it's not. That's racist to say that, and it's not. In a way, it doesn't matter where it originated from. The fact that it's spread, and wherever a virus originates from today, in today's country or societies, it's going to spread because we travel so much more. We also know that there are cultural differences and risk factors associated with suicide. We know that loss of faith can lead to suicidal thoughts in Asian communities. School problems are more common precipitant in Asian and Pacific Islanders. Cultural distress is a risk factor for Latinx students as they try to navigate between their culture of origin and then trying to become more westernized or more Americanized. And then we said earlier, experiencing racial discrimination places African American youth at risk as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about protective factors. Protective factors are characteristics that can help youth adapt to different levels of hardship. And the important thing about protective factors is that inherent in them, there has to be adversity. So something is protective if in the face of adversity, it buffers or protects that young person from the impact of the adverse situation. Protective factors can be grouped into 5 categories: strong family support and relationships, religious and spiritual engagement, community and social support, personal factors like positive self-esteem or emotional well-being, and factors like stable housing, income, and employment. When I'm teaching my graduate students, we talk a lot about this last factor, because one of the things I share with them, I can share with you too. If we put a clinic on every corner and we made mental health care free, treatment free, it still will not have the same impact that if we would give everyone housing, stable housing, people had a livable or earning wage, and people were consistently employed. That's the biggest thing you could do to prevent suicide and to prevent mental health challenges, is make sure that people live in stable communities, they have stable housing, they have steady income, and they're steadily employed, and they're not underemployed. Okay, so looking at these protective factors a little more closely, what many of them have in common is they promote a sense of social connectedness and mattering. Social connectedness is different levels. You can look at the individual level, at the number of social connections or your social circle, but it's also at the community level. Do you live in a cohesive community? There's a term called collective efficacy, and that means that your neighbors look out for you and they kind of look out for your kids. When I was growing up, I lived in, I was an Army brat, so I lived all over the world. And then my parents, my dad went to Vietnam, and so my parents, my mom and my brother and I, we settled back in Baltimore, where my parents are from. And I remember that I lived within about a 5-block radius of almost my entire extended family. And so there was no such thing as getting babysitters in my family. There were 30, my mom was one of 14, and there's 32 cousins. So when you became 12 or 13, you babysat, and that was that. And no one ever, you couldn't charge because it was family. And sometimes I took cousins on dates with me, because if my aunt said I need a babysitter and I had a date, guess which one went out? It was a babysitting job. So I just had to do that. But I also remember when I would come home from school, I was in the band, I was taking flute lessons. My aunts knew when I was supposed to be home, and they would literally be out on their porch waiting for me to walk by their house. And if I was late, by the time I got home to my house, my mom already knew if I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing or hanging out with people I wasn't supposed to be hanging out with. My mom knew all that before I got home. So that's a good example of collective efficacy. We also know that mattering is really important. Mattering is not that you're tolerated, not even that you're accepted, but that you're celebrated. And this is one thing that faith communities are really good at, helping people to feel that they matter. So mattering is you feel like you make a difference in the lives of other people. That people don't just notice your presence, but they notice when you're not there. People care about what you think, they care about what you say, and they care about how you feel. People are happy when you're successful, they celebrate you, and they're sad when you fail. People rely on you, they depend on you, and they appreciate you. And the degree to which people feel like they don't matter is the extent to which they feel marginalized. So during this pandemic, particularly because we're socially isolated right now, I have been very concerned about the mental health and well-being of people in my congregation. So we have actually been meeting more since the pandemic through Zoom. So that's why Pastor Steve and I was able to help with Zoom, because we're on Zoom 3 to 4 times a week. We have our worship service on Zoom. We have Bible study on Zoom. We started a book club, which meets every other Thursday, where we read books, and we don't read religious books. We just read regular books everybody else reads. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about a book called Right as Rain by George Pelecanos. I always mispronounce his name. So we read mysteries, we read romance, we read different kinds of books. And a different member of the congregation leads the discussion. It's been a lot of fun. I also have been doing a stress management mindfulness group on Tuesday evenings, and it has warped into not only are we doing relaxation training and messages, but we also working on our being more active, more physically fit, and we've also been doing a lot of emotional eating. And so it's been amazing to see people walk more, people are eating better. Several people have lost, I think the most women's lost is 32 pounds. We're not putting on the COVID-19, we're taking it back off. And this is all of the things that you can do on Zoom in your community. And guess what? It's free. So it doesn't cost any money. So these are all the things that you can do to help people feel connected and make sure that they feel that they matter. Risk factors, relationships amongst protective factors are very complex. And so, for example, when we look at the role of religious involvement, it's not just, people typically think it's because there are cultural or religious prohibitions against suicide, but it's much more complex than that. It's also that the faith community provides a community support. It provides a sense of connectedness, a sense of commander-ing, and also religious prohibitions. And of the 4 factors here, what seems to be the most important is the community support and the connectedness. We also know, when we look at the impact of COVID, as I said earlier, we're very concerned as mental health professionals and researchers and policymakers, advocates, because when the pandemic started, I remember telling some of my colleagues, we're going to see an increase in suicides in communities of color, because we knew that we were disproportionately going to be affected by it, not just the illness itself, but also other risk factors. We knew that people are more likely going to be unemployed, underemployed, they're going to lose their jobs, people might get evicted. People who are undocumented are afraid to go to get support or get help for unemployment because they're afraid of being deported. So we knew this was going to have a more negative impact on these communities. We also know that things that typically create stress, job insecurity, housing insecurity, food insecurity, which are risk factors, and then a decrease in the connective factors of social connectedness will increase the likelihood that suicide will occur, and those risk factors are disproportionately affecting communities of color. We also know that calls to crisis centers and hotlines have gone up 800%. 800%. And unfortunately, we also know that African Americans typically don't use hotlines. So one of the things we have to figure out is how we can get people to use hotlines more because they are very effective. And also, what do we need to change about the culture of hotlines so that they are more accessible and appear to be more friendly, user-friendly for members of communities of color. And then we also know that economic downturns can lead to suicidal increases. However, we also know that the relationship between stress and race-related stress, which is really traumatizing at times, can be moderated by social resources. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about treatment engagement. There are significant racial ethnic disparities in the use of mental health services due to structural barriers and social determinants of health. We know that the rates of engagement in treatment and treatment completion are lower in Black adolescents compared to white adolescents. Some of this is due to negative perceptions of systems of services. I've been talking a lot lately with systems of services and talking with them about doing a time of self-reflection about, are your services accessible, not just the physical building, but what happens when someone comes in for treatment? Who are they greeted by? How are they greeted? Is there a lot of red tape? One of the things that we help churches do sometimes is develop a resource directory, and we ask that you update that at least once a month, because when someone's in crisis, they don't want to be fumbling around trying to find a provider, and they also don't want to have to call 4 or 5 providers to figure out who takes their insurance, for example. So those are things that you can help someone with by being their eyes and ears and arms, so you can help provide that information so that they can have access to services right away. We also know that people are reluctant to acknowledge symptoms, and we know that Black youth are less likely to receive outpatient treatment, even when you account for other factors. And then we also know that Black youth are less likely to receive care for depressive symptoms and suicide attempts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, community norms don't really support professional help seeking. So there's a lot that has to be done with this. We have to make services more accessible, more user-friendly. We have to make sure that Black youth are not being underdiagnosed for depression and suicide attempts. And we also know that Black adults are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. To make sure that so we make sure we have culturally competently trained professional mental health providers so that that doesn't happen. But we also need to develop community norms that promote help seeking. Now, one of the things about the public health challenge for suicide in the Black and Latinx community is that the suicide rates are highest amongst Black and Latino youth, and these communities are disproportionately younger. So we need to identify culturally salient and risk and protective factors at the individual, family, and community level. But we also need to develop culturally sensitive, or what I call culturally relevant interventions. And we need to develop programs within institutions and communities to increase sustainability. This last factor is so critical. If we have clinics of every mile and the people in the community don't trust the clinics, they won't go. So part of that, we have to think creatively outside the box. Where else can we develop programs, or at least link people to services? Because that will create sustainable programs and sustainable treatment programs. So a little bit about why do we know so little about suicide in youth of color. One is because we assume universality. We know that not all different communities of color may express depression and suicide differently. And yet, if we assume that it's universal, then what's happening is the measures that we use or the surveys that we use to assess suicide risk are missing people because we're not asking the right questions. We also know that very few interventions are shown to be effective for racial ethnic groups, primarily because they're not in the sample. That's the number one reason. We also know that they're not identified in samples. My colleagues and I, we did what's called a systematic review of all of the suicide interventions. We studied over 800 articles in professional journals, peer-reviewed journals, and we found that we couldn't really say too much about what worked and what didn't, except for restricting access to lethal means, because most people do not identify people by age or by gender or by race in their samples. And so they just lump everyone together. So we don't know if something is more effective for one group or another. There's also a problem with funding research from communities of color. In a very recent review, it was found that Black investigators were half as likely to receive NIH funding than white investigators, and that at every level of the grant process, Black investigators are less likely to be funded, including submission rates, the grants being discussed in a review meeting. If your grant is not discussed in a review meeting, then you're not scored. If you're not scored, you don't get the money. So what can we do? So I'm going to suggest we use an upstream approach. Not that treatment is not important, but I also think that we have to rethink about how we can prevent suicide so that kids never get to the point of wanting to take their lives. So what can we do to help children not just survive, but thrive? And what can we do to minimize or eliminate risk factors, enhance protective factors at the individual, family, and community and broader societal levels? And so my suggestion is to think about having partnerships with faith communities. I think the church is an excellent place for promoting positive mental health, not just for Black Americans, but all people, because it's one of the most influential institutions within the Black American community. 87% of Black Americans are affiliated with the church, and over 60% of Black youth attend church regularly. And one of the things I love about church is that, unfortunately, moms are more likely to go to church than dads, but guess who controls if children go to church? Moms. So it's a really good place to do an intervention. So why should we think about doing mental health care in faith communities? We know that mental health issues affect people across faith traditions. Faith leaders in faith communities are often first responders. And so a faith leader, like your pastor, might find out or figure out that someone is suffering from depression or anxiety way before that person seeks a mental health professional. And so you see people more regularly. I also often joke that faith leaders make house calls when mental health professionals do not. Faith communities care for the whole person and their families. Faith communities interact with people in diverse settings. Congregations include people from diverse settings. And so I was sharing with your pastor earlier, I actually helped to develop 2 mental health centers in faith communities. And in both of those situations, we did not have to look outside the congregation to get the mental health professionals. In the first one, it was called Baraka, which is Swahili for healing and for blessing, excuse me. And we had a psychiatrist, we had 2 licensed psychologists, we had about 4 social workers, and we had 2 addiction counselors. We started that center in January, and we did a needs assessment in the congregation. This is a mega church, it's very large. Did a needs assessment where we asked people what were the major concerns that they were having. We opened up our doors in January. We had 300 people in a month. So we were overwhelmed, and couldn't even manage all of that. So people are hungry for help, and people just need to be given permission from the pulpit that it is okay to seek mental health. We also know that mental health crises are also crises of faith. There are barriers to seeking help from faith communities, beliefs that suicide violates the faith community or cultural gender role norms. So we know that for some people of faith, they think mental health illness is a sin or it's a moral failing. They believe that suicide reflects a lack of faith or weak faith. In communities of color, people will sometimes say, I still hear this, that suicide is something that white people do. We've talked before about the stigma associated with mental illness, and also that suicide is an unpardonable sin. So I want to say a little bit about that. So one of the things you can do to address the suicide as an unpardonable sin is to reframe that view. There are 6 cases of suicide in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. These are the references for them: Saul, Ahithophel, Zimri, Samson, Abimelech, and Judas. This comes from the classic book from James Clemens, What Does the Bible Say About Suicide? In each of these passages, the Bible does not comment one way or the other about the suicides. Also in the Hebrew text, or what some people call the Old Testament, there is no word for suicide in the Old Testament, which suggests that the idea or the concept of suicide was a later development in Hebrew culture. In early rabbinic writings, under certain circumstances, suicide was considered to be justifiable. If someone was trying to force someone to commit idolatry, murder, or if someone was trying to force a person to engage in a forbidden sexual act. In Christianity, the concept of suicide as being unpardonable comes from Augustine in the early church in the 4th century. There were people who believed that if they had mass suicides, that they could skip purgatory and go directly to heaven. And so they viewed that as a form of martyrdom. And so unfortunately, large groups of Christians were getting together, having suicide pacts, sort of having a frenzied kind of worship experience and then killing themselves. And they consider that to be an act of piety. And so this became so problematic that Augustine issued a series of edicts, basically saying that suicide was an unpardonable sin. And in that time, the state and the church were not separate. So it was also not just an unpardonable sin, it was a crime against the state. And so his interpretation of that comes from the commandment, thou shalt not kill, from the concept that life is a gift from God, so we don't have the right to take our lives. Other people view suicide as blasphemy against God because, and I've heard this a lot, that you can't, it's unforgivable because you can't ask God for forgiveness. So I think we need to remind ourselves that God is infinite and that our sense of time, which is finite, is not God's sense of time. And so even if someone is not conscious anymore, we don't know what God is doing in those moments, in those seconds between life and death. And we don't know, I believe God is still speaking. And because we don't see the person talking about it or hear them say forgiveness, I'm asking for forgiveness, doesn't mean that they're not doing it. It means that we can't experience it. So we don't know that. And also, even if suicide is a poor choice, it doesn't rescind God's grace. For us to say that suicide is unforgivable is like us saying that the suicidal act is stronger than the saving grace of Christ. And my understanding of the Bible is that there's nothing stronger than the saving grace of Christ. So I call these PSAs, I do these a lot. So God's grace is not depending on our faith. And that's good news, because if it depended on our faith, we wouldn't have grace, okay? All of us have faith that falters from time to time. So the good news is that people in faith communities have broadened their understanding of mental illness. There's less religious stigma associated with suicide, particularly people look at suicide more, even in the Catholic Church, as being an issue about mental health challenges and mental wellness, and that in that moment, the person, because they're suffering from a mental health challenge, cannot have a quote unquote sound mind, so cannot make more rational decisions. More and more people see mental illness as a disease like any other disease, and it's not a reason for shame or guilt. And the silence is also being broken, and clergy see their roles as partners. And let me say a little bit about that. That's really important. I think particularly in the historical Black church, it was kind of like one-stop shopping. And so the clergy was sort of everything. The clergy was your social worker, your therapist, your confessor, your friend. I mean, just all these multiple roles. And I think that what we have to come to is that what we all want is for people to be whole and healthy, and we each have a role to play. And certainly clergy have a role to play, and mental health professionals have a role to play. So we don't need to be adversaries. We can be co-laborers in helping people get through their journey so that they can not just survive, but thrive. So we can also, one of the things I've been talking about all this evening is that the faith community can really foster a sense of connectedness and mattering. These are some kids. Every year we have, this will be our first year we can't do it. We have a Halloween party for kids. They dress up in their costumes, and we have different prizes at different age groups. These are kids at the Easter egg hunt. And about twice a year at our church, we have game day. So we have an abbreviated service, and then people play all kinds of different board games, card games, all kinds of games. And we do that in the sanctuary. Lots of educational opportunities. This is where I think the faith community can make a huge impact, because on your Sabbath, you have a captive audience. And so pastors are very influential leaders and can give people permission to get mental health help just in their sermons. As we know, sermons are designed to be persuasive. And so I think having Bible study lessons on mental health seeking and suicide. So we, in our church, we have workshops on environmental justice. We have conferences on suicide in the Bible. We have Bible study on depression and suicide. I've taught in seminary before. I've actually designed a course on depression in the church. So there's lots of ways that you can do this. We also have, in July is Black and Indigenous People of Color Mental Health Month. And so in July, we have people get up and share their stories about their own struggles or their children's or their parents' struggles with mental health challenges. And those stories are very powerful. And those stories really break yokes, because it normalizes a discussion that we can talk about suicide and not feel stigma. We don't have to feel ashamed. And that all people go through this. We even have people talk about their medication. So that's really important. We also have narratives of hope in faith communities. This is our church. We've been socially distancing since early March, and so we have not met together in person, but we did to get together on Juneteenth to have a Black Lives Matters rally. And so we socially distance, and our church is off of a major highway, so a very busy street. And so it was wonderful for us to see each other. But it was also wonderful with the community response that we got. People were honking their horns and waving and smiling. So this is our youngest church member. This is Isaiah, who's just turned 1. And he and his dad both have on Black Lives Matters t-shirts. You see where everybody's masked. This is me and my oldest granddaughter outside the church. This is our Black Lives Matter banner. And this is my daughter who has a rainbow flag, just so don't forget that all Black lives matter, not just Black straight people's lives matter. This is actually a picture of our church in the background. So faith affirming culture through stories, really of people overcoming adversity, really is a very powerful mechanism and a tool that you can use to help reduce stigma. Also, every year, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, I was on 2 of their task force, the research task force and the faith-based task force, which I'm still on. Every year, we have a national weekend of prayer for faith, hope, and life. It's always the 3rd week of May. This year, you can have lots of activities in your church. They have tools that you can get online. We always have a sermon there. We have workshops there. We have Bible study lessons about this every year. I think at this point, my church has done it so much, I think they can teach it, not me, because we've done it so much. And so again, these are things that you can do in your faith community. So I just wanted to let you know, it does take a village. I think all of us in this, being in this together, can do this work. It is a work of love. It's an act of love, but I think it's so important. And I think I was sharing, I did a workshop yesterday with graduate students and doctoral students and STEM careers. And I was telling them, you have to see yourself as a person who can help with suicide prevention. You don't have to be a mental health professional to make a difference. All you have to do is be a good listener, and you have to care. And I think no one does caring better than people in faith communities. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sherry. That was wonderful. And that was a lot. So I'm sure everyone's
I know.
and trying to understand maybe some of the things you heard. But what we want to do now is open up for about 20 minutes for questions from people who are on Zoom right now. And the way we're going to do that is Heather is going to be in charge. Heather, do you want to wave at people or say hello just so people know who you are? If you're not in the what is it called? Gallery view, you can click gallery view, you'll see her. But just want to open it up. If you have a question, it could be about something you heard or something maybe you're just wondering about in your own life. If you want to chat with Heather right now, she'll be asking those to Dr. Sherry. Also, after maybe Heather's asked a few questions, if you can't figure out the typing thing, we can maybe wave some people down and let them just ask off of mute. But Heather, do you have anything yet? We can give it a minute here.
We got a question early on about the youth breakdown of the chart you had for the suicide. If there was any sort of breakdown for youth that are in foster care.
Great question. And that data, no. Although they probably could do it because they do ask kids about residency. But we do know that kids in foster care are definitely at risk because they have a lot of transitions in their home. A lot of kids who are in foster care. I know I used to do therapy for kids in foster care. I think one of the challenges in foster care is that, at least in the area, in the DMV area, there's a strong norm for family reunification. And sometimes, well, that's a good goal. It also keeps kids trapped in limbo because what happens is the goal is for kids to be reunited for parents. Parents are not able to do the things that the state or the system is asking them to do so they can be reunited with their kids. And it goes around and around and around. And so most of the kids I saw would start out with between 6 months to a year of foster care, end up being 4 and 5 years. And at that point, then the state will decide they can't be reunited. And now the kids are it's hard for them to be adopted because they're older. And so those kids have higher risk, and also they're sometimes moved abruptly and they don't know why they're moved. And something else could be going on. Maybe it's a safety issue, but they don't know that. And so they're shifted, they have to shift schools. It's hard for them sometimes to stay in the same school district, so that means they're losing friends back and forth. There may be antagonistic relationships between their family or their extended family members. So, and the court system, I know at least in the DMV is the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. I used to sometimes ask them, like, how do you make these decisions of where to place these kids? Because they place kids in different states from the same family. The kids don't get to see each other. It also makes it impossible for the mother and father to do the things to comply, because trying to meet with all the different therapists in the different jurisdictions. So it's, yes, these kids are definitely at risk.
There is a question on whether this presentation will be available. We are recording this, so we can make it available on both Facebook and on social media. So we can send out a post about that. Just one second, we have another one. Do you have any info on the efficacy of some of the social apps that are available for people to use that help people that are depressed or at risk for suicide?
Yes, I love apps. Apps are great. There are apps, a lot of apps. There are relaxation apps. So there's some for stress management, excuse me. Some for stress management. There are apps which can help you monitor your mood. Johns Hopkins has a really good, if you go to their website, just look up depression apps on their website. You'll see several there. If you just Google it, you'll be amazed. I mean, there's a lot, and a lot of them are free. So I would strongly encourage you to do the ones that are free if you can. Well, hold on for just a second, because I actually have a list here, or I can send you all the list. There's one called Calm, which is really good. There's blocking on the other one that people commonly use. Yes, but there are also some therapists use apps to help you monitor your mood during the day. And so they're like, some of them are very basic. You may just have different happy faces, like a sad face, a little bit of a frown, a neutral face, a little bit of a smile, and a big smile. And maybe several times a day, you just click on that app to let your therapist know how you're feeling. And we do a little bit of that. We have a training clinic, and we also do a little bit of that with our training clinic. So we'll have some clients monitor that. We particularly do that if we're having a client who's really what we call acutely suicidal, which means that their risk is higher. So we might have them check in several times a day using these apps so we can monitor their mood. We will also develop a suicide risk plan for them about, if you're showing this emotion on this app, and this is a plan we have that what we're going to do.
Okay. Another question is, how long did it take you to get your programs up and running? Was it gradual or over a period of years? Or did your church intentionally put up these programs together with the idea of addressing mental health?
That's a good question, because I've done different things in different churches. So let me start with the first one. So the first church, which was the mega church, which was the Ame Church, and I started there, I was there 10 years. It took several years. We would, the mental health, because it's such a large church, 10,000 people, so there were several mental health professionals there. We would be doing these workshops in other church communities and not our own. We would go and meet with the pastor, and he would say it's a great idea. Nothing would happen. I remember we all wrote proposals, and so nothing happened. And so I remember we used to joke about this, because when I started that, I had no kids, and then when we got the center going, I had 2. So it took 4 or 5 years. I don't know what happened. I think it was the Holy Spirit. One Sunday, the pastor got up in the church and said, several of the mental health people in this church have been trying to start a center for several years, and I think we need to do it. And truth be told, my family probably needs counseling. And he just started talking. And we're all like, oh, Jesus is coming now, because it took so long to get this going. And it was like, in 2 months, we were up. And it was so amazing to see how God moved in that. We got a building. We had an entire floor of an office building that was donated to us by a hospital. And they charged us $1 for rent for 5 years. We had somebody else pay for it, because the phone systems in a center is really intricate and it's expensive. because you can't drop calls. It has to be a call system, has to be a way to make sure that the messages are not ever lost and all that kind of stuff in case someone has an emergency. So we were thinking, how are we going to pay this $1,000 phone bill a month? And someone in the church paid it every month for 3 years. These are all anonymous donors. The church paid for people's, your pastor and I just told me this, they paid for people's mental health for 5 sessions for the whole church for a year. Now they stopped doing that because it got to be too expensive, but they just said we want everyone to have free services. So that was the first church. The second church, by the time I got there, I think by that time I had more of a reputation in the community, ironically not for suicide prevention. What I was known for was intimate partner violence and helping parents navigate through schools when their kids had their kids were being tested for special education and they wanted to know how to navigate that system. So one of the things I share with researchers is that if you want to partner with the faith community, you don't need to come with an agenda. You need to do what they need. And a lot of people didn't want to talk about depression and suicide, but they wanted to talk about how would I do if my kid has an IEP? So I was like, okay, cool, I can help because I teach assessment then. I can help you with that. And then the intimate partner violence part, just because seeing clients, too many women coming in with black eyes, fingerprints on their necks, and the church is like turning the other way. And so I was, sharing with some of the pastors that we have to do better than this because we're watching people being beaten and physically abused, and we're just acting like we don't see this. So I started, again, not in my own church, because my own church deacons were like, no. So I was like, cool, I just did it in other churches. But then I got a reputation for that, and then that's how we got a counseling center started in the second church. Again, we had professional people, so you could be any profession you want, but you just have to be licensed. And the church paid for their malpractice insurance, and we charged a nominal fee. And we started within that building, but we had problems with boundaries. I think, even though we explained to everyone it was confidential and it's important not to interrupt the service, people would come see, hi, Pastor Sherry, and I was like, no, in the middle of a service, in the middle of a session. So they bought a house across the street from the church, and they set up the center in that church, in that house. And that was all that we did in that house. So that was the second one. The third time I've done it is in my own church. And I think it was easier just because I was very intentional. My husband's a lawyer. He was very intentional about we would start that way. I think when you're an established church already, it's harder. But because we founded the church, we started from the very beginning. We jokingly say my sermons are group therapy. So I'm always talking about mental health. There's probably not a sermon I've done where I don't talk about mental health, something. And sometimes I don't use those terms, but I talk a lot about family dynamics and challenges in families. And one of the sermons I've done, which has been the most impactful, but people don't like initially, is called That's the Best They Can Do. Just getting people to see your parents are who your parents are, okay? And at some point, we have to give up on them being somebody else. And it's not to say you don't deserve them to be someone else, or you don't deserve to have been loved a certain way, but I hate this phrase, but it is what it is. And so there are other people that God will send you who will give you what you want. It might be your grandmother, it could be a foster mom, it could be a play mom, it could be your next door neighbor, it could be anybody. But you can't turn that away from that to say, no, it's going to be my mom. She's going to do the right thing. Your mom may never do the right thing. So sometimes I do sermons like that where we're not specifically talking about mental health terms, but I am talking about your mental health. I'm saying to you, I want you can be happy and you can be whole. You need to choose it. And there are lots of texts for that. I mean, the woman with the issue of blood, the man at the pool, it's just lots of text for that. So you can do that. So my church was a little easier. And my church, particularly when we started doing the tell your story, sharing your stories, broke yokes, amazing. Some of the most poignant ones have been younger people when they get up and talk about their struggles with bullying, talk about the importance of counseling, how to really help them. And just, the adults are sobbing and crying, and sometimes they didn't know the kids were going through that. But the young people being brave enough to tell their story is what makes adults stop being so scared. Because the young kids, my kids talk about this all the time. I have to remind my kids, not everyone's in therapy, okay? Because they just, they're calling me, their friends are calling me. We've had people living with us almost every year I've been in ministry, because one of my children's friends is suffering or things aren't going well at home, and they stay with us for a while. We've had kids live here 3 years, it was the longest, I think. But the good news about that is that my kids are not scared to talk about mental illness, and they're not scared. To them, it's like normal. And I think because they're trusted friends, they can normalize it too. I mean, I've gotten calls in the middle of the night with people who are not members of the church, but someone knows of someone who knows of someone who knows of someone. And so I just made someone a referral the other day, and I don't even know how she got to the church. I just know when I picked up my answering machine, she was saying she's really struggling with anxiety. So we got her some help, even in the context of COVID. And I was telling her, this is a good time to get treatment, because you know what? Teletherapy, they relaxed all the laws. You can talk to a therapist in any jurisdiction right now. Normally, you can't do that. But now, because of COVID-19, your therapist could come from DC, and you're in Portland, I could do it, because no one's gonna care about the jurisdictional and the licensing differences, as long as it's a licensed professional.
There's 3 questions that kind of tie in together, so I'll try to tie them without being overwhelming. How much has the attitude of the Evangelical Church changed toward engaging with mental health services in the last 20 years, and how much more progress is still needed? Second part, what are some ways that lay people and churchgoers can help shape those norms?
Good questions. So the Evangelical, you mean church or movement? Yeah, I think you mean movement, so I'll say movement. It's diverse. So there are some evangelical churches who are very pro getting mental health, go to professional person, it's okay. There are other churches who maybe focus more on the enhancing the protective factors without necessarily encouraging you to go to a professional. So they might focus more on social connectedness and mattering, and will basically say, you don't need to go to a mental health professional, because all that you need is in our church community. What I say to that is, I think that mattering and social cohesiveness is extremely important, but I don't think it's enough for everybody. And I feel that this is just my view. Theologically, that is not I'm trying to use a nice word here. It is not what I believe an accurate representation of the scripture. And the scripture is over and over again, God works through people. And for us to suggest that God only heals supernaturally is just not the text. I think all of us want a supernatural event, because we feel that's when we know God's there. But most healings and most miracles in the text, as I read them anyway, are from people. God sends people all the time, and very ordinary people like you and me, which leads to the next question. What can you do? You can just be there. I'm serious. You can be present. You can be a good listener. You could develop, one basic thing your church can do is develop a resource directory. Just you have Jenna there who knows this stuff in the back of her hand. So she can say, these are the resources we have available. Put the numbers in the bathroom. That's what we did to destigmatize it. Because people don't want to go to the community table, and you don't want to see with the brochure. Cool, no problem. We put the brochures, we tape them into the bathroom. When we were doing the domestic violence work in my former church, one of the shelters had this really cool thing. They put safety plans and empty tubes of lipstick. So they went to the manufacturer of lipstick people and asked them, could we have the tubes before you put the lipstick in it? And they donated it. You'd be amazed. That's another thing. You'd be amazed if people will donate. I mean, a lot of things we've done in our church, we get do for free. We have ice cream socials, and they always donate the ice cream. We don't, stuff like that. We can go to our local grocery store and get, the food and stuff, because they need to do it for their community service. So It's not that hard to get that done. But anyway, so they roll these safety plans into the tube of lipstick, because we know that when people are in the throes of intimate partner violence, that their partner who's violent, if they see them getting help, will hurt them. So this is something you can keep in your purse. And then we would do safety plans with women. We would do it as part of our women's Bible study. We would have safety planning, like things like back your car in so that you can drive out forward, keep some clothes in the car, have a place already planned that you're going to go. Do not go to your relative's house, because that's the first place the person looks. So we did stuff like that. So there are really basic things you can do. How to link, there's a gatekeeper program called QPR, which teaches you how to link people to services. So QPR teaches you the warning signs of suicide, how to be a good listener, how to be a good helper, and link people to services. That's it. It's not asking you to be a therapist. So it's like, let's each do our part. And where you all can help is that you know the people, and you can tell people it's okay to go to help. It's okay. It's okay for your pastor to say, this is beyond my expertise. Even as a therapist, I don't treat every problem. There are certain things I don't treat because it's beyond my expertise. My daughter has a friend with OCD, and I said to her, I don't treat OCD. OCD is a specialty. And if you have OCD, there's great help out there. There are great therapeutic interventions, but you need a specialist for that. You know, I don't do eating disorders. You need a specialist for that. So everybody, you don't need to be all things to all people.
Okay, and this is the last question for this evening. Are there statistics for suicide among women living in domestic violence?
Yes. So unfortunately, the rates for women in domestic violence are also high. Obviously, living in an intimate partner violence home is very, very stressful. I think law enforcement has gotten better about taking these calls seriously, but still there are lots of loopholes that people can get around with, even with restraining orders. And so women who are victims of domestic violence are at high risk for both homicide victims and suicide. We are particularly worried about this right now because in the social isolation that's involved with COVID, you have people who are staying at home who live together, and it's not a healthy environment. And because they have to socially distance, they don't have any place else they can go. So what we've been doing in our church is we're asking people to please keep your eyes and your ears open, and are you willing to take someone into your home, sometimes at an emergency. And I know that's scary right now with the social distancing, but we can figure out how to socially distance in your house. But you need to, if you have loved ones that you suspect are in these kinds of situations, please look out for them. Right now, a lot of shelters are at capacity, and so there's no, proverbial room at the inn. And so we need to figure out alternative ways to keep people safe.
All right, well, I'm gonna take it from there. Huge thank you to Dr. Sherry for all your wisdom.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Right before we leave, we just want to open it up. Jenna O, who is someone who attends here at Portland Covenant, she works with one of the local counties in preventing suicide. And so Jenna, I just want to open it up to you if you have any maybe things you want to share with people about how they can continue to learn and grow in this area.
Sure. I'm happy to share some local resources. Yeah, again, thank you, Sherry, for being here. I learned so much, and I'm really excited. That we got to have this conversation, and I'm hoping that we can continue learning through the resources we have available here. So I'm going to share my screen. So I guess before I do that, I'll just say a lot of the times we think about suicide prevention as prevention. So kind of helping, making sure it doesn't happen before that, and kind of early on working on that. And then intervention and postvention. So postvention being, what do we do once suicide has happened? How can we support people who have been impacted? So I have some resources around those three. And let's see, can I pick the right screen? Okay. So great thing about having virtual meetings is that I can just share my screen and just pop up the resources that we can find online. All of us can find. So first is if you find this information interesting and you want to learn more, then we have free training. So one of the trainings that Sherry mentioned, which is QPR, question, persuade, and refer. It is available for anyone who works or lives in Multnomah, Washington, or Clackamas County. And the website is here, which I can put in, and I think I can share with. Somehow I'll share afterwards. But this website is called gettrainedtohelp.com. You can just type that in and it'll lead you to this website. And so here you can actually sign up for QPR. It kind of shows you what QPR is. And then if you want to sign up for the class, there's various times. So we have one pretty much every week, and they're offered through a virtual meeting. So you zoom in for the training, and it's 2 hours. Basically walks you through how do you respond, like when sometimes we find ourselves caught off guard when people when we're concerned or when people show signs. They're thinking about suicide. How do we approach them in a way that is safe and inviting for them? So this training is really helpful and really is designed for anyone. And then this is a much more robust version of learning if you're interested. It's actually happening this weekend, called Hope Rising for Suicide Prevention. It's they wanted to kind of do a global summit for suicide prevention, and they're going to and it's all this is available online. They have a lot of speakers. They included peers, so people who have struggled with suicide, ideation, thoughts, attempts, who survived suicide attempts. They will be here to talk about from their perspective what it means to have help for suicide. And then if you are really actually struggling, if you are in need of help soon, and or if you care about someone who you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you can access this number, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And this is completely free, and you can reach help 24/7. And it's, as Dr. Moloch, Sherry mentioned, it's a very effective service. And so what are some help available when people, when we already have suicide that happen in our community? We have some support groups. And so if you go online, it's American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And you can find support groups for our area. If you put in 97203, like I did, we have actually a couple support groups that people can go and really talk with people who really know what it feels like to walk through that experience and get support. I also want to share this resource. I don't want to overload, but this is just trauma intervention program. It's it's a nonprofit, a group of people who are trained to support communities, organizations, community groups that have recently experienced suicide, and people, or maybe just attempt, and there's a lot of trauma around that. This group is trained to support, and they have really systematic way and very sensible way of supporting community. And I believe it's free. And then if you are more in the mood for advocacy, so I just want to share this information. I can't invite you to take action on it, but just so you know what's happening around our nation, the current conversations, people are trying to make 988 as a number to call for suicide prevention, so that people can quickly reach for help. Just like 911, we know that suicide is an emergency, just as any kind of accident or physical emergency is. So those are some resources. There is a lot. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to kind of look around together. Yeah, if there's definitely a lot. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenna, for those links. And we're going to be, Heather's writing all those down. We're going to be following those up in email. But that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just want to say again a special thank you for Dr. Sherry for joining with us. At our church at Portland Covenant, we like to clap like this in our screens so people can see. And so we just really appreciate you. I want to let people know, if you're on here and you've lost someone to suicide, I just want you to know that you are not alone. I personally have lost an uncle and a cousin to suicide, and just wanted to say that, just if you're out there and you feel like you need someone to talk to, I want to make sure that you know you can talk to me. But also, if you want to continue your journey with the church community, or you want to hear more about classes like this, I would just invite you to follow our church on Facebook or Instagram. You can find both by typing in Portland Covenant Church. You can also always visit us on our website at portlandcov.org. But with all of that said, Dr. Sherry, would you mind praying for us as we close today?
I would be honored if we could assume a posture of prayer. Dear gracious and merciful God, we come to say thank you. God, we thank you so much that even in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, even in the midst of living in a world which seems so chaotic right now, even living in a midst where sometimes it seems that justice will never prevail, you are still here, you are still large and in charge, and you are still keeping your promises to never fail or leave us or abandon us. And so God, in this moment, we thank you for creating a space and a time where we could talk about something that we know is near and dear to your heart, which is suicide prevention. Help us to be ever mindful, God, that we can create a world, that we are the ones that we have been looking for. We can create a world where young people will want to be here, where young people can get the help that they need, where everyone can get the help that they need. We can create a world where people feel loved and embraced and affirmed, where they feel mattered, like they matter, and where they feel socially connected to others. We are the ones who can create that, God. So give us the strength, give us the courage, give us the creativity, give us the wherewithal to create a space and a time, God, where everyone can feel loved. God, we thank you for this moment. We thank you so much for Pastor Stephen, who thought it not robbery to present, to even organize this webinar. And then we thank you, God, for all of the people on the line this evening who took out time, precious time from their day, from their evening, to talk about this such important topic. Now, God, we ask that you help us to be steadfast and movable, always abounding in your work, because we know when we work for you, it's never in vain. These are blessings we ask for us in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, everyone. Just have a great week, and feel free to reach out to either me or Dr. Sherry. Dr. Sherry, if they want to follow you, is there a good way to do that?
You can go to our website, our church. I'll put my email in here. And my church's website. So that's Moloch at dw.edu and Beloved Community Church, md.org.
All right. And if you want to contact me at all, just go to portlandcov.org and you can send an email to me directly through that. You can also find me on Facebook or Instagram by typing in my name. With all that said, have a great night, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, and take care and be safe.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you. Bye, Mom.